Hey there. If your mind is racing tonight, you are in good company. I'm Nick, and I have been there too many times. That feeling when you cannot turn your thoughts off no matter how tired you are. Tonight we are going to change that together. These eerie tales and gentle sounds will slow everything down until sleep finally finds you. Just a handful of ads in the first 10 minutes, then completely ad-free so your rest stays peaceful. If this helps quiet your mind, please subscribe and show some love with a like. Share in the comments where you are listening from and what is keeping you up. You are safe here. Now let us begin together. The jar she held up to the window was labeled in a hand she had come to recognize as her grandfather's, though she had never in her life seen his handwriting before this week, with the single word June. And through the glass and the gray light of a February that had lasted, the woman at the hardware store in Ross River had told her, since October, she could see that the jar contained nothing at all, or rather, contained the same nothing that all sealed containers must hold, which is the air the moment they were closed, preserved. She set it back on the shelf among its hundreds of companions. Each jar bore a label in the same careful blocked letters, and each label named something that should not have needed naming. Snow, first week. Ash from East Stove, March. Pine, Green Needle, South Slope. Creek Sound, afternoon. This last one puzzled her. How do you capture a creak sound in a glass jar? Until she noticed the small wax cylinder nested inside, no larger than her thumb, etched with grooves so fine they caught the window light and turned it into a faint iridescence, as though the recording itself had become a kind of mineral. Maeve had been in the cabin 4 days. She had driven the Alaska Highway from Whitehorse in a rented truck whose heater worked intermittently, turned north onto the gravel road the solicitor's map had indicated, and found the track. 2 ruts through spruce so dense the branches dragged along both doors. That led to her grandfather's property on the Pelly River. She could not remember the name of the rental company. This had not troubled her at the time and did not trouble her now, though later she would recognize it as the first of several gaps in the journey that she had paved over without noticing. The way one paves over a crack in a road. The surface holds, the driving is smooth, and the fact that the ground beneath is hollow only matters when the weight finally breaks through. The cabin was not what she had imagined. She had expected squalor, the hoarding of a man whose mind had gone to pieces in the northern dark. Canned goods stacked to the rafters, newspapers from decades past, the ordinary debris of isolation. What she found instead was order. Meticulous, exhaustive, categorical order. Every surface in the cabin held jars. The kitchen shelves, which in any reasonable dwelling would have held flour and salt and dried lentils, held instead rows of vacuum-sealed glass containers arranged by what appeared to be date and season. The bedroom, a narrow cot pushed against the north wall, a wool blanket folded into a rectangle so tight its edges could have been ruled at its foot, had been half consumed by shelving that held jars of a darker hue, their contents ranging from soil samples to what appeared to be frozen condensation scraped from the inside of windows. In the main room, where a wood stove still held the ashes of a fire no one had tended since her grandfather's absence, was reported in November by a trapper who had come to trade and found the cabin sealed, the door latched from inside, no answer to his calls. The jars formed an architecture of their own, walls within walls, avenues between shelving units, a small city of glass that caught the low winter light and held it, trembling, in thousands of tiny, redundant suns. She had not known her grandfather. This was the central fact around which the week had organized itself, and it required, she felt, no apology or explanation, though the solicitor in Whitehorse had seemed to expect one. Her mother had left the Yukon at 19, moved to Montreal, married, and never spoken of her father except in the compressed shorthand of estrangement. He chose to live that way. It was his business. There was nothing to be done. When the letter arrived, her mother was 3 years dead by then, and Maeve was the only surviving relative the territory could locate. She had felt not grief, but a kind of puzzled obligation, the way one might feel upon inheriting a house in a country one had never visited, built by a person one had never met, for purposes one could not guess. The purposes were becoming clearer now, or at least their scope was. She moved through the main room, reading labels. Rain, September 2003. Fog, morning, river. Birch bark, fallen, not stripped. Mouse sound, wall, January. Breath, cold, visible. This last jar she lifted and turned in her hands. It was sealed with the same vacuum mechanism as all the others. Her grandfather had evidently purchased or fabricated hundreds of these lids, each fitted with a small rubber gasket. And inside she could see nothing, only the faintest clouding on the interior glass, like the ghost of an exhalation. The basement she had not yet entered. The hatch in the kitchen floor was bolted from above with 3 separate locks, each a different type. And she had spent the first 2 days searching for keys among her grandfather's effects before finding them in a leather pouch hung from a nail inside the stovepipe, an unlikely location that suggested either eccentricity or a serious desire to prevent casual access. She had the keys now. She had not yet used them. On the desk, the only surface in the cabin not colonized by jars. She had found the journals, 14 of them, each a hardbound composition book of the kind sold in stationers' shops, their covers warped and stained with decades of wood smoke and handling. They were numbered, and the first 3 were written in a hand so different from the jar labels. Loose, slanted, the letters running into one another with an urgency that the careful block printing of the labels had long since disciplined away. That she had at first mistaken them for a different person's writing. They were also written largely in a language she did not speak. Scots Gaelic, she guessed, from the sparse English passages that interrupted the dense, slanted text, like clearings in a forest. Her grandfather had come to the Yukon from Inverness. Her mother had mentioned this once, indifferently, as though the fact were no more significant than his preference for black tea, which she had also mentioned, and which Maeve had confirmed by the tin of Assam she found in the otherwise jarless kitchen cupboard, its contents reduced to a fine brown dust that dissolved when she touched it. She sat on the floor with the journal number 4 open in her lap, the first written entirely in English, and read, "The ward is complete through the south wall. 46 jars this month. I have sealed the November rains, 3 jars, the heavy rain, and the 2 lighter. The first ice on the river, 1 jar scraped and sealed before it could return to water, and the sound the wind makes through the gap above the door where the frame is warped. I do not know if the sound will keep. The wax takes the impression, but whether the impression holds the thing itself or only its likeness, I cannot say. It is the thing itself I need." She read this passage twice. The phrase, "the thing itself I need," seemed to her to carry a weight the rest of the entry did not quite support, as though the words were pressing against something beneath them, an anxiety or a knowledge that the surface text could not accommodate. But the next entries were practical. Descriptions of his sealing technique, notes on which jars had held their vacuum and which had not. And the anxiety, if that was what it was, did not recur for several pages. The light outside the window had not changed since morning. This was expected. In February, at this latitude, the sun traced a low, brief arc, more gesture than illumination. But she found herself checking the window more often than the short days warranted, as though expecting something in the cast of the light to shift. It did not shift. The spruce stood black against a sky the color of old ice, and the cold, which she could feel through the cabin walls despite the stove, had a character she could not name, a kind of attention in it, as though it were not merely the absence of warmth, but the active presence of something that was pressing against the cabin from every direction at once, testing the walls, the windows, the seal around the door, the way water tests a dam, not with force, but with constancy, with the absolute certainty that it will find the weakness and that the weakness will be enough. She returned to the journal, the Wendigo. I have written around the word for years now without writing it, as though the word might summon the fact. But the fact does not require summoning. The fact is here. The fact has always been here. It was here before I was. I will set it down plainly. The valley is hungry, not the animals in it, not the river. The valley itself. A hunger that does not eat, but consumes. A hunger that does not kill, but empties. I have watched it take the color from the autumn and leave the trees bare, not with the ordinary bareness of winter, but with a bareness that suggests the trees have never had leaves, that the concept of leaves has been removed from them, and they stand now in a state not of loss, but of never having had. This is what I am warding against, not a creature, a condition. Maeve closed the journal. The stove needed feeding, and she had been sitting long enough that her hips ached from the cold floor, and the jar of June on the shelf behind her caught the stove light as she moved and flared briefly. A small, contained sunrise in the gray room, and she thought, he was a madman, of course, and what I am reading is the record of a madness, and the jars are its symptom, and the proper thing to do is to catalog them as the solicitor has asked, and arrange for their removal and let the estate be settled and go home. She thought this clearly and completely, and it did not help at all. The basement, when she finally opened it on the 5th morning, was not what the cabin above had prepared her for. She had expected more shelves, more jars. The collection continued downward. What she found was that the basement was the collection. Her grandfather had excavated by hand, judging from the pick marks on the frozen earth walls, a space 3 times the footprint of the cabin above, and he had lined every surface of it with shelving, and he had filled every shelf with jars, and the jars here were different. The jars upstairs were specimens, curiosities, a man's eccentric engagement with his surroundings, taxonomic in impulse if not in rigor, the kind of collection a naturalist might assemble if the naturalist's definition of nature had expanded to include not just organisms, but phenomena, weather, sound, the behavior of light at certain hours, unusual but comprehensible. The jars in the basement were not comprehensible. They were larger, for one thing. Gallon vessels, some of them, sealed with the same vacuum lids, but reinforced with wire, and in some cases, with what appeared to be wax poured over the seal. Their labels were longer and more specific, and the specificity was of a kind that troubled her, because it suggested that her grandfather had not been collecting objects, but events. Thaw, April 12th, 1974. South-facing bank above river. Duration, 6 hours, 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. Spring runoff, creek behind cabin, May 1981. First audible flow after freeze. Temperature change, February to March, 1993. The moment of turning. She knelt beside this last jar, the moment of turning, and held it up to the light of the lantern she had brought down the ladder. The jar was sealed and intact. Inside she could see nothing, less than nothing. The glass seemed to contain air that was not merely empty, but stilled, as though the air inside had been caught in the act of changing and frozen mid-transition, the way a photograph catches motion and holds it, except that what was caught here was not motion, but the potential for motion, the instant before the world decides to become different from what it has been. She did not open it. She set it back on the shelf with a care that surprised her, because she did not believe in what the labels claimed, and yet her hands moved as though what the jar held was not nothing but something volatile, something pressurized, something that would, if the seal broke, resume the process it had been arrested in the middle of. The way a river resumes its course when an ice dam gives way, not gradually, but all at once, the accumulated force of the interruption, released in a single motion. There were thousands of jars in the basement. She counted shelving units, 42, and estimated rows and depth, and arrived at a number between 4,000 and 5,000. Her grandfather had been in this cabin for 50 years. That was roughly one jar every 4 days for 5 decades, which meant that the work had been continuous and unrelenting, a daily practice as regular as prayer. She opened 3 jars upstairs that afternoon. Snow, first week, November 2019. She broke the seal, a small gasp of equalized pressure, the sound any vacuum jar makes when opened, and inside found what she expected. Nothing. A trace of moisture on the glass where condensation had formed and evaporated at some point during the jar's seal life, but otherwise empty. She set the open jar on the kitchen counter and wrote in her catalog, jar labeled Snow, first week November 2019, contents, nil, seal intact, vacuum present, no visible contents upon opening. The second jar, Pine Needle, South Slope, September. This one contained a single brown pine needle, desiccated to the point of translucency, resting on the bottom of the jar like a hair in an otherwise empty reliquary. The third, Ash, East Stove, January 2017. A fine gray powder, perhaps a tablespoon's worth. That evening, the woman from the hardware store in Ross River, who had driven out to check on her as she had promised to do every 3 days, told her that the temperature had dropped 8 degrees since morning, and that the forecast was calling for the coldest night in 11 years. Maeve said she had enough firewood. The woman looked at the open jars on the counter and asked what they were. Maeve said they were part of the estate, and the woman nodded and did not ask further. And later, standing beside her truck in the yard, with her breath making shapes that the dark dismantled instantly, she said something about the winters here that Maeve did not entirely catch, something about how the old man had been a good neighbor to the cold, as though the cold were a person who could be neighbored. In the night, Maeve woke to a sound she could not identify. Not wind. She knew wind, and this was not it. Not the stove settling. She knew that too, the small percussion of contracting metal. This was a sound like something tightening, like rope under increasing load, or like the sound a lake makes when the ice is thickening, a low, almost subsonic groan that she felt more in her sternum than her ears. It lasted 5 or 6 seconds. Then a silence followed that was different from the silence before. A held silence, an attentive one, as though whatever had groaned was now listening. She waited for it to repeat. It did not. But the silence remained held for a long time after, and when she finally slept again, she dreamed of standing in a room whose walls were made of ice, and the ice was pressing inward, not cracking but compressing, and the room was getting smaller at a rate so slow she could not see it happening, but could feel it in the change of pressure against her eardrums. And when she woke in the morning, the thermometer on the porch read -41. She looked at the number twice because the forecast had predicted -28, and -41 was a number she associated with emergencies and evacuations, not with mornings that looked through the cabin window exactly like every other morning she had seen here. Gray, still, the spruce standing like a congregation of the patient dead. She opened 7 more jars that day. She was systematic about it. She had brought moving boxes from Whitehorse, and she was packing the jars, opened, emptied, cleaned, into the boxes for transport. And the empty jars made a sound when they touched each other that reminded her of something she could not place, a thinness in the ring of glass meeting glass, as though the jars, emptied, had become less substantial than jars should be, though she knew this was ridiculous. The glass was the same glass, empty or full, and she was attributing qualities to objects that objects do not possess. But the jar she opened at noon, Thaw, South Bank, March 1998, released when the seal broke, a smell. Not a stale smell, not the smell of old air, or degraded rubber, or the faint industrial breath of vacuum seals, but a smell of wet earth, brief, unmistakable, specific. The smell of ground that has been frozen for months and is now, for the first time, thawing. She knew this smell. Everyone who has lived through a northern winter knows this smell. It is the smell of spring arriving, not as a season, but as a physical event. The ice in the soil surrendering its grip, and it lasted less than a second. The time it took for the jar's contents to equalize with the cabin's dry, stove-heated air. And in that second, she wasn't in the cabin. She was standing on the south bank of the Pelly River in March of 1998, and the ground beneath her feet was softening, and the world was deciding, as it decides every year, to become a different thing from the thing it has been. Then it was gone, not faded, taken, pulled out of the room the way a draft pulls smoke from a chimney, the smell of wet earth replaced by a cold so sharp it stung her nostrils, a cold that did not belong in a heated cabin, a cold that came from nowhere inside and therefore came from outside, from the valley, from whatever was pressing against the walls and testing the windows and had, in the instant the jar opened and the spring escaped, fed. She could feel the aftermath of it, a pocket of frozen air hanging where the thaw smell had been, as though something had inhaled the warmth and left a void. She put the jar down. She did not open another that day. That night the thermometer read -47. The stove was burning hot. She had fed it until the iron glowed. And still she could see her breath inside the cabin, and the cold pressed against the windows with such force that the glass flexed inward. A barely perceptible bowing that she checked 3 times with her palm flat against the pane, and each time the glass was curved where it should have been flat, as though the outside air were not merely cold but heavy, laden with a density that ordinary air does not possess. The journals became her occupation. She spent the rest of that day and the next reading through numbers 4 and 5 and 6, the English passages growing longer as her grandfather's Gaelic apparently failed him, or as the things he needed to say exceeded the reach of the language he had learned here, in the valley, from the cold and the river and the animals, and the 50 years of silence that had pressed his thoughts into shapes his mother tongue could not accommodate. He wrote about the ward with the specificity of an engineer and the conviction of a priest. The jars were not, he insisted, a collection. They were a containment system. Each jar held not merely a specimen of the valley's phenomena, but the phenomenon itself. The actual thaw, the actual snowfall, the actual sound of the creek at a given hour on a single afternoon. He distinguished carefully between representation and capture. A photograph of snow represents snow, but the jar held the snow's occurrence, the fact of its having fallen, sealed away from the valley's continuous present so that it could not contribute to the valley's ongoing life. He was not preserving these things. He was removing them, taking them out of circulation the way a government removes currency from an economy, and for the same reason. To prevent a catastrophic inflation, a runaway process that would, if left unchecked, spend the valley's entire store of change in a single uncontrolled expenditure, The Wendigo, he wrote, was this process. Not a creature, not a spirit, though the Casca people whose land this had been understood it better than anyone. Having lived alongside it for millennia, having learned to feed it small portions, a season here, a frost there, to keep it from gorging. The Wendigo was hunger for the passage of time itself, a hunger that, if unfed, would consume not objects or people, but duration. The valley's ability to move from one state to another, to change, to age, to progress from winter to spring. And the feeding had to be continuous because the hunger was continuous, because time does not stop pressing forward, and every moment of the valley's existence produced another increment of change that had to be captured and sealed before the Wendigo could consume it, before the valley's allowance of transformation was spent. Maeve read this and felt two things simultaneously, and the simultaneity was the problem, because the two things were incompatible, and she could not hold them both, and yet she was holding them both. The first thing she felt was the certainty that her grandfather had been ill, that this was a document of obsessive-compulsive disorder layered over late-onset psychosis, a systematized delusion of a man whose isolation had been absolute for decades, whose mind had built an elaborate architecture of purpose around the simple fact of its own deterioration. The second thing she felt was the memory of the thaw smell from the open jar and the way it had been taken. Not dissipated, not faded, but pulled from the room as though something outside had drawn breath and swallowed. She went to her catalog. She checked the dates and the numbers. On the day she opened 3 jars, the temperature dropped 5 degrees. On the day she opened 7, it dropped 14. The correlation was not perfect. The day she opened 1 jar, the temperature dropped 2 degrees, which was proportionally wrong. But it was close enough and consistent enough that the alternative to her grandfather's explanation was not the comforting diagnosis of madness, but something she did not want to name, which was that the jars were doing what he said they were doing, and that by opening them, she was not emptying containers, but unsealing processes, releasing into the cabin captured instances of warmth and seasonal change, and that the released changes were being instantly consumed, inhaled by the cold, devoured by whatever pressed against the walls, and that each feeding made the hunger heavier, denser, more present, and the winter outside deeper and more permanent. She opened the oldest journal, number 1. The Gaelic was dense and the hand was young, and she could make out only fragments where the English cognates surfaced. Ward, seal, time, keep, hunger, spring, hold. And one passage near the end of the first journal, written in English with a steadiness that suggested it had been translated from internal speech, composed and refined before being set down. What I have taken from the valley, I have taken to keep the valley alive. The taking is the keeping. If I stop, the hunger eats everything at once. Every spring that would have come, every thaw, every warm day, all consumed in a single swallow. The ward holds. It must hold. There is no one after me to hold it. She sat with this for a long time. The stove burned. The jars on the shelves caught the firelight and held it, each one a small amber world, and the cold outside pressed against the cabin with the full weight of something that had been testing these walls for 50 years and had found, this week, the first openings it had encountered since the locks were set. And she thought about the phrase, "There is no one after me." And she thought about her mother leaving this place at 19 and never returning. And she thought about the woman in the hardware store saying he was a good neighbor to the cold. And she thought about a man standing in this room, in this light, every day for 50 years, sealing away the valley's springs so that the hunger outside could not swallow them all at once. She found journal number 14, the last. The handwriting here was not the urgent slant of the first journals or the disciplined block print of the middle ones, but something else. A tremor in the letters that was not age or weakness, but a kind of care, as though each word was being set down the way the jars were sealed, with the understanding that it might need to last longer than the hand that wrote it. I have done the arithmetic. The basement holds the springs, 4,011 jars, 50 years of thaw of runoff, for the moment the ice decides to go. The cabin holds the small things, the daily weather, the sounds, the specific weight of a Tuesday in June. Together they are the ward. Together they hold the valley in winter, which is the only season the hunger cannot eat, because winter is already the absence of change, already the stillness the hunger wants. And if the valley is always winter, then the hunger has nothing to consume, and the valley persists, frozen, alive, persisting. The cost is that nothing here will ever change again. Not while the ward holds, not the seasons, not the river, not me. This last sentence Maeve read 3 times. Not me. 2 words that could mean, I will grow old here, unchanged in my purpose. Or could mean something else. She went outside. The cold hit her like a wall of glass. Not painful at first, but absolute. A cold that did not attack the body, but simply replaced the air with something that was not air, something denser and more still. And she stood on the porch and she looked at the valley. It was not a valley that was merely cold. She saw that now. She had been seeing it all week without understanding what she saw. The spruce trees were not dormant. They were arrested. Their branches held in positions that were not the positions branches hold in winter. The slight downward sag of snow load and dormancy, but the positions branches hold when they have been stopped mid-motion, a gust of wind frozen halfway through its effect on the canopy. The river was not frozen the way rivers freeze, with the uneven surface of water caught in its turbulence. The river was frozen flat, the surface so smooth it looked poured, as though the water had not been moving when it froze, but had already been still, for so long that the concept of current had been removed from it, the way leaves had been removed from the trees in her grandfather's journal. Not lost, but never had. She went back inside and closed the door and sat down beside the stove and opened the Journal 14 to the last entry. I have done what I could. The ward will hold as long as I hold it, and I will hold it as long as the ward holds me. These are the same duration. When one ends, the other ends. I do not know what comes after. I do not know if there is an after. I know only that the valley persists because I persist, and I persist because the valley does, and this is the arrangement, and it is enough, and it is not enough, and there is no one after me to hold it. She did not decide to release them. That was not what happened next. What happened was that the cold came in. She woke before dawn on the 8th morning to the sound of glass breaking. 2 jars on the kitchen shelf had cracked, their seals intact, the vacuum undisturbed, the glass itself fractured by the cold, which had descended in the night to a depth the thermometer could not properly register. The red spirit in the tube sat below the lowest mark, which was -55. Somewhere in a range the instrument was not built to measure. The cabin walls had contracted in the night. She could see the gaps, new gaps, where the logs had pulled apart from each other along the north wall, and through the gaps the outside air entered not as a draft, but as a presence, a dense, slow-moving current that pooled on the floor and rose, and where it touched the jars on the lowest shelves, the glass frosted opaque in seconds, and the rubber gaskets contracted, and the seals her grandfather had maintained for decades, began to fail. She heard them going, a soft, arrhythmic percussion of vacuum releases. The sound of jars losing their seals as the cold crept upward through the shelving, each failed seal releasing a small breath of captured warmth that was instantly devoured, consumed so quickly she could feel the suction, a pull against her skin each time a jar gave up its contents to the frozen air that was eating its way through the cabin from the floor up. The stove was useless. She fed it until the wood was gone, and the heat it produced rose to the ceiling and stayed there. A layer of warm air 2 feet thick pressed against the roof, while the cold filled the cabin from below like water filling a sinking boat. She could not stay in the cabin. She could not leave the cabin. The truck had not started since the temperature dropped below -40, and Ross River was 80 kilometers of unplowed road away, and the cold outside was not survivable, not for the time it would take to walk even a fraction of that distance. She went to the basement. The basement was no warmer than the cabin. The frozen earth walls radiated the same killing cold. But the basement held the oldest jars, the ones her grandfather had reinforced with wire and wax, and their seals had not yet failed. The jars upstairs were cracking because the cold had found them. The jars in the basement were intact because the wax held, and because the earth, even frozen, insulated against the convulsive contractions that were splitting the cabin's wood and glass. She sat on the basement floor among the jars and listened to the sound of seals failing overhead. Each one a small concussion, a tiny surrender, and after each one a silence that was not silence but feeding, the held, attentive quiet of something swallowing. She picked up a jar. Thaw, April 12th, 1974, south-facing bank above river, duration 6 hours, 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. It was warm in her hands, not the ambient warmth of a heated room. The basement air was bitter, her breath clouding thick, but a warmth that came through the glass only where her skin touched it, as though the sealed spring inside responded to contact the way a living thing responds to touch, offering its heat only to the hands that held it. The warmth stopped at her wrists. Her arms remained frozen. The jar was a small, private sun that warmed nothing but the 10 points where her fingers pressed the glass. She broke the seal. The sound was not the small gasp of the jars upstairs. It was larger, lower. A sound like a held breath released after decades, not loud, but deep, with a resonance that seemed to come from the jar and the shelf and the frozen earth walls simultaneously, as though the basement itself had been holding this one breath and could now, finally, exhale. And the smell. Wet earth, April, the south-facing bank, hit her like a wall, so dense and immediate that she stumbled backward, not because it was unpleasant, but because it was too real, too present. A fist of spring punched into a room that had known nothing but frozen stillness for half a century. The warmth lasted 2 seconds. Then the pull came. From above, from the hatch, from the direction of the failing cabin, a suction that stripped the thaw smell out of the air so violently that her ears popped, and in its wake a cold that was not temperature but appetite, a void cold, a cold that had the quality of something that has just eaten and is already hungry again. She opened the next jar because the cold was unbearable, and the jars were warm. Spring runoff, creek behind cabin, May 1981, first audible flow after freeze. The seal broke with the same deep exhalation, and sound poured out. Not from a wax cylinder, but from the air itself, the chatter of a creek through softening ice. And the sound filled the basement. For 1 second, 2, 3, and then was swallowed. Ripped upward through the hatch, consumed. The silence after was heavier than the silence before. The hunger was growing. She opened the 3rd jar, the 4th, the 7th, the 12th. Each one released its captured spring into the basement. The smell of rain on dust, the sound of wind through new leaves, the physical sensation of warmth on skin. and each one was consumed faster than the last. The first jar's spring had lasted 2 seconds. By the 12th, the warmth was gone before she could feel it, taken so quickly that opening the seal produced not warmth but cold, the vacuum loss of warmth, the thermal signature of something feeding. She should have stopped. She saw this clearly even as she reached for the next jar. Each one she opened was making it worse. Each release spring was feeding the hunger that pressed against the cabin, and the hunger was not sated by feeding, but enlarged by it. The way a fire is not diminished by fuel, but grown, and she was fueling it. She was the mechanism of its feeding. She was doing exactly what her grandfather had spent 50 years preventing. But the jars were warm, and her hands were going numb, and the cold from the hatch was now a visible thing. She could see it. A faint distortion in the air, a thickening. The way heat shimmers above a summer road except inverted, the shimmer of cold descending the ladder rung by rung. And the warm jars were the only warmth left, and her body made the decision her mind had already refused. The 13th jar slipped, not because the glass was wet or her grip was careless, but because her fingers did not close around it fully. They went to the place where the glass was and continued slightly past it, as though the distance between tension and contact had widened by some fraction too small to measure, but too large to ignore. She caught the jar with her other hand, opened it, felt the 3-second spring consumed in one, and reached for the 14th. And this time she watched her fingers as they gripped the lid, and the grip was wrong, not weak, thin. The pad of her thumb against the metal lid did not compress the way flesh compresses against a hard surface. It met the metal, and the metal did not deform under it, and her thumb did not deform either. And the sensation of contact was present, but diminished, like hearing a sound through a wall. The information arrived, but stripped of its texture. She opened the 14th jar, and the 15th and the cold took each spring before the smell could form. And by the 20th, her hands had lost the ability to distinguish between the glass of the jars and the air around them. She could see her fingers close on the lids. She could see the rote motion of gripping and twisting. But the feedback, the resistance of the seal, the temperature of the glass, the weight of the jar settling into her palm, was arriving late and faint, as though her hands were reporting from a growing distance. The smells came faster now and in layers that did not belong together. Wet earth and pine resin and river mud and the dry electric scent before a thunderstorm, all of them arriving simultaneously and pressing against each other in the closed basement, like passengers in a car filling with water, each one trying to occupy the same diminishing space. The sound was worse. 50 years of creek chatter and rainfall and wind through canopy arriving not in sequence but in chord, a pressurized wall of acoustic information that she could feel against her face, against the thin skin of her eyelids, a physical weight of sound that drove the air from the basement not outward but inward, compressing it until the pressure built behind her sternum and her breathing became shallow and rapid and insufficient. And still the hunger pulled from above, dragging each arriving season upward through the hatch with a force she could feel in her inner ears. She stopped counting after the 30th jar, or the 40th. The counting had become impossible because the jars were losing their individuality, each one releasing its captured spring into a space already so saturated with consumed and consuming seasons that the individual contributions could no longer be distinguished, and her hands were moving with a desperate automatic regularity that she could not have stopped even if she had decided to, not because the hands were acting without her, but because the cold was killing her, and the jars were the only heat. And the body does not stop reaching for warmth while the body still exists, and the question of how long the body would continue to exist was one she could not yet bring herself to examine. She was breathing, but the air she breathed had no substance. It filled her lungs and left nothing behind. The basement had been emptied, not of air, but of whatever makes air breathable. The ability to hold warmth or smell or sound, stripped from it the way her grandfather had described the concept of leaves being stripped from trees. She was drowning in a medium that was not water but vacuum. The negative space left behind when everything that makes a place livable has been consumed. She climbed the ladder. The cabin was disintegrating, not from the cold, from the absence of what the cold had consumed. The wood of the walls had gone gray and fibrous, the grain open and soft, the texture of wood that has been dead for decades without the preserving cold to hold its structure. The jars on the kitchen shelves, the hundreds she had not opened, were cracking, their glass clouded, their contents escaping in thin streams of captured weather that the air devoured before they could travel a foot from the shelf. The cabin was losing its coherence, its surfaces separating, its joints opening, not because the temperature had destroyed them, but because the thing the ward had held at bay, the hunger for duration, for the passage of time, had been given enough to grow strong enough to take what it wanted directly, and what it wanted was the 50 years the cabin had been exempted from. Through the window, the glass still held, barely, flexed inward until the pane was convex, the view through it distorted. She could see the valley. The spruce trees were doing something she could not immediately process. They were moving, but not in wind. They were moving through time. She could see it happening, the branches budding and leafing and browning and dropping and budding again, season after season, cycling through in minutes. The valley's spent timeline being pulled through the trees the way thread is pulled through a needle, and the thread was running out. She turned back to the cabin and saw her grandfather. He was in his chair by the desk where he had always been. He was wearing his wool coat, the same coat she had taken from the hook by the door on her first evening. The coat she was wearing now, except that she looked down and she was not wearing it. Her arms were bare. She had never been wearing it. The hook by the door was empty and had always been empty. And the coat had never left the body of the man who had died in it. And the warmth she had felt when she put it on. The warmth of good wool, the comfort of a garment that fit, had been the ward's last courtesy, dressing the possibility in the memory of warmth so that she would not question why the cabin was survivable. And now the ward was failing and the courtesy was withdrawn. And beneath the coat, her grandfather was not a body, but the remainder of one, the bones held in their chair by the same stasis that held the valley. And he had been there since she arrived, since before she arrived, and she had not seen him because the ward preserved not only the valley and the cabin, but the coherence of everything inside it, including the pretense that the man who maintained it was still alive. The pretense was ending. She could see the coat settling as the body beneath it continued the process of collapsing that it had been arrested in the middle of, and the desk was warping, the journals curling, the ink on their pages fading to a color that belonged to documents, aged beyond what paper can survive. And the cabin was dying around her, 50 years of deferred decay arriving all at once. She looked at her hands. They were wrong, not cold damage, not frostbitten. She would have understood those injuries, would have known what she was seeing. This was different. Her fingers were fading. The skin had a quality that was not transparency, but thinness, as though the hands were a photograph being slowly overexposed, the image still present, but losing its distinction from the white around it. She pressed her fingers together and felt them. They were solid. They were real. The sensation of skin touching skin was intact. But the sensation was growing quieter, the way sound grows quieter, not because it is becoming softer, but because the medium conducting it is thinning. She went back to the basement. Not to open more jars. There was no purpose in that now. The hunger was feeding on the cabin itself, consuming the structure directly, taking the years from the wood and the nails and the glass without requiring the jar's mediation. She went because the basement still held the oldest jars, the ones from the early 1970s, and among them were 3 jars whose labels she had read but not understood. The possibility of return. Spring 1971. The warmth of imagining what comes after. May 1971. A face not yet real but warm. The spring of the one who comes. 1971. The first jar was different from the others. She saw it before she understood what she was seeing. The wire around its lid had been cut, not corroded, snipped cleanly with pliers, the ends bright, where the tool had bitten through. The wax over the seal was cracked in a pattern that was not the pattern of thermal stress, but of deliberate breaking. Thumbs pressed into the wax and pulled apart, and the seal itself was open. The vacuum was gone. The jar was empty. She lifted it. It weighed what an empty jar weighs. It was not warm. The glass held nothing. No captured spring, no sealed weather, not even the faint interior clouding she had come to associate with her grandfather's preserved air. It was the emptiest thing she had ever held. Emptier than the jars she had opened and drained, because those jars had at least held the memory of their contents, the residual moisture or smell or temperature trace. This jar had been open long enough that even the memory was gone. She looked at the label. The possibility of return. Spring 1971. Her mother had been born in 1973 and had left at 19 and never come back. This jar had been sealed 2 years before her mother existed, and it had been opened deliberately, carefully, by hands that knew what they were doing, at some point after. She looked at the second jar, the warmth of imagining what comes after, also open. The wire cut, the wax cracked, the seal broken. The third, a face not yet real but warm, empty. All 3 jars were empty. All 3 had been opened by her grandfather's hands. She recognized the plier marks, the same tool he used to twist the wire on the sealed jars above. He had opened them. He had released their contents, and their contents. The possibility of return, the warmth of imagining, the face, not yet real. She held the empty jar against her chest and felt nothing. No warmth. No response. The glass was dead against her sternum, and the deadness of it was the deadness of a thing that has already given everything it held. And what it held was standing in the basement holding it. She felt something change in her hands. The fading that had been gradual accelerated. The thinness deepened, and the sensation of the glass against her sternum grew distant, as though the jar were moving away from her even as she pressed it closer. She looked down and could see through the translucent skin of her fingers the label on the jar, and the label said, "The one who comes." And the word "comes" occupied more space in her vision than its letters warranted, expanded, demanded attention, because the one who comes was not her mother. Her mother had gone. The one who comes was the one who returned, who traveled the highway and rented the truck and read the journals and sat in the cold and chose. The one who comes was the shape the possibility had taken when it opened. The cabin overhead was falling. She could hear it. The slow, exhausted sound of a structure giving up its claim on its own shape. The wood splitting along grains that had been held stable by the ward, and were now free to do what wood does when it is left alone in a northern winter for 50 years, which is to split and warp and open and finally disintegrate. She could hear the jars breaking, thousands of them, the cabin's city of glass, shattering shelf by shelf as the shelving buckled and the walls bowed inward and the roof. She heard the roof go, a long, low groan, and then a sound like exhalation, like a breath held for 50 years finally released. The cold poured in. It came through the floor, through the hatch, through the failing ceiling of the basement itself, and it was not the cold of winter, but the cold of appetite, the cold of something that has waited 50 years to consume what it was owed and is now consuming it. And she felt it touch her, and she felt what it took. Not heat, not the warmth of her body, but duration. She felt her own timeline accelerating. She felt the passage of time resume in her body at a rate that was not the rate of living, but the rate of catching up. And her hands, the hands that had held the jars, that had broken the seals, that had cataloged and cleaned and written the notebook, were aging, were going through the process that all hands go through in a life except compressed into seconds, the skin thinning and spotting, and then thinning beyond skin into something that was not skin at all, but memory of skin. The recollection of a surface that had once covered a hand that had once been real. She was not his granddaughter. She understood this now in the body, in the fading hands and the thinning arms and the legs that were no longer carrying her weight because they no longer had weight to carry. She tried to remember Montreal. She reached for it. The name of her street, the apartment where her mother had died, the color of the front door, and found that the memories were there but thin, the way the glass of the emptied jars was thin, present but drained of the substance that made them real. Her street had no name. Her apartment had no number. The solicitor in Whitehorse. She reached for his office, for the room where she had sat and signed papers and received the map, and the room was a sketch. 4 walls and a desk, and a man whose face she had never been able to recall, and whose name she now understood she had never known, because there had been no solicitor. There had been no letter mailed to Montreal. There had been only the keys in her pocket, and the map in the glove box, and the knowledge of where to go, placed there by the same mechanism that had placed her on the highway heading north, a possibility aimed at its origin. Her mother's face, which she had carried with her for 3 years since the death, and which she had believed she could recall in every detail, was a composite, a sketch, a face assembled from the idea of a mother rather than from the memory of one. She reached deeper. The truck she had driven, the name of the rental company she had never been able to recall, the hardware store, the woman's voice, and each memory she examined closely. Lost its resolution, the way a word repeated too many times loses its meaning, until she was holding not a life but the shape of a life. The outline her grandfather had imagined in 1971 when he sealed the possibility of return into a jar and needed that return to be convincing enough to walk and choose and believe itself real. She was the jar marked the possibility of return. She was the warmth of imagining what comes after. She was a face that was not yet real, sealed in 1971 and opened by her grandfather's hands at the end of his life. Open so that the possibility could walk and drive and arrive and decide what to do with the ward. And the possibility had to believe she was real, because a possibility that knows it is a possibility cannot choose. And she had chosen. She had broken the seals, and the choosing was real, even if the hands that broke the seals were not. The basement ceiling gave way. Light came in. Not the gray light of the February she had lived in for a week, but a different light, a warm light, a June light. And through the opening where the cabin had been, she could see the sky. And the sky was not the sky of winter or the sky of summer. but the sky of a place where every season has arrived and departed in the same hour. A sky that had been blue and gray and white and dark and blue again in the time it took the cabin to fall, and was now simply empty. The color of air that has spent everything it held and has nothing left to show. Her hand on the ground, not resting. She had no weight with which to rest, but touching. The fingertips she was ceasing to have in contact with the earth she was ceasing to feel. The ground was warm. This was the last thing. The ground was warm for the first time in 50 years. The banked heat of 4,000 open springs rising through the bare soil where the cabin had stood. And the warmth was already going, the hunger pressing down through the open sky, consuming the ground heat, the way it consumed the thaw smell and the creak sound, and every captured spring and the cabin, and the man in the chair and the woman who had believed she was his granddaughter. The warmth passed through her dissolving hand on its way to being devoured, and for the duration of its passing she was warm, the way a window is warm when sunlight falls through it on its way to the floor, not warmed, not holding the warmth, only briefly in its path. Then the hunger took it, and the ground where her hand had been was cold, and the valley was silent. And the silence was not the silence of winter, but the silence of a place that has spent its entire future in a single afternoon and has nothing left. Not a season, not a sound, not the memory of a cabin or the possibility of a girl with which to fill the quiet that remains. My brother's hand was on my shoulder the last time I sat in the gallery and heard the hymn. I did not know then that it was the last time. No one does when the last time comes, which is a mercy I am thinking about now in the dark, where all the years I spent cutting glass and binding leather and teaching my fingers to find holes in stone have led me. The gallery is where the speakers keep the oldest words. And the oldest words say, the world was once lit and warm and wide before the falling that brought the stone down and the giants in. The hymn itself I cannot reproduce here nor anywhere outside the gallery. It belongs to the stone. Heffen once told me it was older than the speakers, older than the gallery, older even than the dark, that the first people had carried it down with them from the time before, when there was no need for such songs because there was nothing yet to be afraid of. I believed him the way I believed everything Heffen said, which is to say, completely and without understanding, the way a child believes that water runs downward because the ground is thirsty. We sat close. Everyone in the gallery sits close. The space is not large. I have walked its full circuit in 211 steps, though the walls curve and a careless man could miss the passage that leads back to the dwellings and walk the loop again without knowing he had done so. The stone overhead is low enough that Heffen could brush it with his open hand when he stood. And I heard him do this sometimes while the hymn was being sung, a dry scraping sound like a man testing the soundness of a roof. He was always testing the soundness of things. Beyond the gallery, the world opens into what the speakers call the old workings. Galleries and shafts and long horizontal passages driven into the stone by the first people, who understood stone differently than we do. The marks of their tools are still in the walls. I have felt them. Regular gouges in parallel series, biting deeper than any edge I know how to make. The first people were stronger, or their tools were, or they had some method of persuading stone to yield that we have lost along with the light. The passages extend further than anyone has mapped. Effine and I explored 3 of them as boys, crawling through collapses where the ceilings had come down, and the stone had settled into new configurations, filling what had been open with rubble that still smelled, after all the generations, as the falling of something I have no word for. Not the stone smell, not the water smell, something that burns the back of the throat if you breathe it in too deeply, and that Heffen said was the smell of the first people's work, the residue of whatever they had done to make the stone obey them. We found things in those passages, iron spikes driven into the walls at regular intervals, so corroded their surfaces came away in orange flakes on my fingers. Sections of heavy cloth stiffened into something nearly as hard as the stone itself, a wheel. A perfect circle of ridged iron mounted on a shaft that no longer turned, cemented by rust into a single fused mass. Heffen took the wheel and kept it in the alcove where he slept. And when I pressed him about why, he said it proved the first people had built machines, and that any people who built machines understood the world could be changed. This was not the sort of thing one said in the gallery or anywhere the speakers could hear. The speaker's oldest words say, "The world is sealed by the mercy of the dark, which keeps the giants above the throat. The giants are vast. Their limbs are jointed in ways that living limbs cannot be, and they reach down through the throat with a noise that travels through the stone before it reaches the air, a grinding, shrieking vibration that sets the teeth aching and makes the water in the channels jump and spill. The noise precedes the white dawn the way nausea precedes vomiting. By the time the light comes, everyone who can move has already pressed themselves into the deepest alcoves, behind corners, under ledges, as far from the throat as the world allows. The white dawn itself is the color of pain. I do not mean it is bright, though it is. I mean the sensation it produces behind the eyes is indistinguishable from being struck, even reflected, even caught at the 4th or 5th angle of deflection of curving stone. The light carries a physical weight. The speakers say this is because the light is not light in the way our small fires are light. It is the giant's weapon, their means of finding us. It searches. It reaches into crevices and around corners and pours itself into spaces that have known nothing but the dark for longer than memory. When it touches skin, the skin burns. When it touches eyes, the eyes die. The turned are those whose eyes have died. They sit in the deepest alcoves during the dawn and are honored afterward, because they have faced the giant's weapon and survived, and because they will never have to fear the light again. I was 13, as nearly as I can calculate. The speakers count years by the completion of full growth cycles in the mosses that line the water channels, which approximate a solar year, though, of course, we did not know that word, when Heffen began telling me his theory. The theory was this. The throat was not natural. It was too regular. Its walls were too smooth. The first people's tools had been capable, as their parallel gouges proved, but the throat was finished to a degree that surpassed even their best work. Therefore, the throat had not been made by the first people. It had been made by whatever lived above. The giants, I said. He did not answer for a long time. Then he said that he did not think the word giant meant what the speakers meant by it. I did not understand. I did not understand most of what Heffen said, but this was a different kind of not understanding, the kind that makes the stomach tight instead of the kind that simply passes over you. He meant something that went against the hymn, and the hymn was as fixed in my mind as the shape of the gallery itself. He squeezed my shoulder and said nothing more about it. The dawn that took him came without warning. The dawns were regular. The speakers had counted them for generations, and their count was reliable. The dawn came at intervals so consistent that a man could walk to the farthest explored passage in the old workings and return before the next. We organized our labor around this knowledge. The tenders who maintained the water channels worked in shifts timed to the dawn cycle. The moss harvesters moved through the upper galleries in the long, safe intervals, retreating to the depths when the speakers gave warning. We had, in our way, domesticated the giant's schedule. We understood when they would come, and we made ourselves absent. But there were exceptions. Perhaps 3 or 4 times in a generation, the dawn came early, or came at a time when no dawn was expected. An unscheduled burning that caught people in the open galleries, in the passages near the throat, in the places where one did not go during a dawn. The speakers had a word for these events. They called them reachings because the giants were reaching deeper, testing whether we had grown careless. Heffen and I were in the upper gallery near the throat when the reaching came. We should not have been there. He had wanted to examine the throat's walls from a closer angle, to feel the surface finish, he said, to see whether the tool marks matched the marks in the old workings. I had followed because I always followed Heffen, and because the speaker's count said we had time. The noise came first, not from above, where the dawn always originated, but from the stone around us, conducted through the rock faster than through the air, arriving as vibration in the soles of my feet and the palms of my hands before it became sound. The grinding, the high shrieking that lived at the edge of what the ear could bear. I grabbed for Heffen's arm and felt him already moving, already pulling me toward the passage that would take us down and away. The light came too fast. It filled the upper gallery from above, not the slow spread of a normal dawn, but a sudden, terrible column that dropped through the throat like a solid thing, like a white pillar of stone descending. It hit the floor of the upper gallery and sprayed outward in all directions, and where it touched me, my hand, the side of my face, the exposed skin of my forearm, I felt the burn that the speakers describe, the weapon heat that searches for flesh. And with the light came a shape, something descending on the central axis of the throat faster than I could track. A mass that displaced the air in a single compressive wave and filled the upper gallery with a roar like stone tearing. The shape passed through the column of light, and the light moved with it. And I understood that the light belonged to the shape, was mounted on it, was part of whatever the giants sent down to take us. I pulled back. I pressed myself into the wall and turned my face into the stone and shut my eyes so tightly the muscles around them ached. And I heard Heffen beside me making a sound I had never heard him make before. Not a scream, exactly. A sound of effort, of physical struggle, as if he were wrestling something that gripped him from above. I reached for him and my hand closed on his shirt and I pulled. And for a moment, I held him. I felt his weight against my grip, his body between me and the light, and then the shape. The descending thing, the giant. Pulled harder and his shirt tore free and he was rising, fast, faster than falling. And the light went with him because the light was the giant's own, and the gallery went dark in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The sound he made as he went up, the last sound I heard him make, was not a scream. It was my name, compressed and distorted by the acoustics of the throat, dopplered by the speed of his ascent. It reached me as a thin, rising note that could have been anything. The speakers later told me it was the giant's feeding cry. They said the giants always cried out when they took someone, and that the cry was triumph and satisfaction, and hunger appeased. But I had heard my name in it. I cannot tell you how long I stayed pressed to the wall after the light retreated, long enough for the stone to cool where it had been heated, long enough for the vibration to stop traveling through the rock, long enough for the dark to return completely, the way it always returned, total, absolute, the only constant the world had ever offered. I lay on the floor of the upper gallery with my face against the stone, and I breathed the burned air, and I waited for something to change, knowing nothing would, knowing the dark was all that was left now that Heffen's hand would never find my shoulder again. The woman who tended the nearest water channel found me there. She did not speak. She took my wrist and walked me back to the dwellings, and the stone under my feet felt different, as though its texture had changed in the hours since I had last walked it. Though, of course, it was my feet that had changed, or the mind that interpreted what my feet reported. Heffen's alcove was as he had left it. The iron wheel sat on its shelf of stone. His sleeping cloths were folded. I sat in his space and put my hands on the wheel and felt the ridged iron under my fingers, and I understood for the first time what he had meant when he said the first people built machines. He had meant that machines could be built again. This is the thought that began everything. I will not say it came as a revelation, because revelation implies a single moment of clarity. It came as an accumulation, as a gradual tightening of purpose that gathered itself over weeks and months until the shape of what I intended became as fixed and familiar as the shape of the gallery. I would climb the throat. I would go where the giants went. I would go into the white dawn and through it, because Hefen had gone through it. And if the giants had taken him, then the giants had him. And what the giants had could be taken back. The problem was the light. Everything else, the height, the smoothness of the walls, the question of what waited above, was secondary to the light. The light killed eyes. The light burned skin. The light was the giant's weapon, and entering it unprotected was entering the weapon's mouth. The turned had survived the light, but they had survived by losing their sight permanently, and a blind man cannot climb. I needed something the world had never produced. I needed a way to enter the light without letting the light enter me. The elder who kept the fires. We had fires, small ones, fed with moss and the dried fungi that grew on the walls of the deepest galleries. They produced a light so faint it was less illumination than memory, a reddish suggestion that vision was possible if only there were something to see. The elder who kept the fires knew things about heat and light that the speakers did not include in the hymn. He was an odd man, solitary in a way that was unusual in the dwellings, where proximity was survival. He told me when I asked him that light could be weakened by passing through certain substances. Water weakened it. Stone stopped it entirely. And there was, in the deepest of the old workings, a vein of something that was neither stone nor water, but partook of both. A dark, glassy material that the first people had apparently known about, because their tool marks surrounded it on three sides, as though they had been in the process of extracting it when the falling came. I went to the vein. I chipped away fragments with the sharpest edge I could make, an iron spike from the old workings, sharpened against stone until it held something approaching a point. The material was hard. It resisted chipping. When pieces did come free, they were dark, translucent, with a depth that I could sense even in the near total absence of light. Holding a chip between my fingers near the elder's fire, I could see the flame through it, but dimmed, reduced, made bearable. If a chip could bear fire, a thicker piece might bear the dawn. This was the beginning of what I came to think of as the work, though I did not call it that aloud. The speakers would not have approved. The speaker's position, refined over generations, was that the world was sealed by mercy, and the proper response to the giants was avoidance, to hide, to press into stone, to make oneself small and absent and invisible. The idea that one might seek the giants, might climb toward them, might go voluntarily into the throat and the dawn, was not heretical exactly. It was worse. It was incomprehensible. The speaker's framework had no category for it. I told no one except the elder. He listened without comment. He had the quality of silence that I have only encountered in people who spend most of their lives tending very small fires in very large darkness. A silence that is not absence of speech, but presence of attention. A waiting that does not demand. When I had accumulated enough of the dark glass, months of chipping, my fingers raw and permanently nicked, the skin around my nails thickened into callus, I began the shaping. The visor needed to cover my eyes completely, admitting no light except through the glass. It needed to fit close to my face so that reflected light could not enter from the sides, and it needed to be thick enough to reduce the white dawn from a weapon to something survivable. I had no tools for grinding glass. I made tools. I found 2 stones in the old workings whose surfaces were rough enough to abrade the dark glass, and I cannot say how many months because I stopped counting. I spent a duration that felt geological. I sat in Heffen's alcove and I ground glass against stone and I listened to the sound it made and I thought about the throat. The climbing gear took longer than the visor. I needed rope, and the world's materials for rope were limited. Strips of dried fungal fiber, braided and rebraided until they held weight, then tested by hanging stones from them in the deep galleries, increasing the load until they broke, then braiding thicker. I needed handholds that I could drive into the throat's wall, and for these I used the iron spikes from the old workings, resharpened and fitted with leather grips, made from the stiffened cloth we found in the collapsed passages, which softened when soaked in water and could be shaped before it dried and hardened again. I needed a harness that would hold me to the wall if my grip failed, and this I made from braided fiber doubled and redoubled until it could suspend my weight from a single spike. I tested everything in the deep galleries, where the walls were vertical and the darkness absolute, and no one came except the elder, who watched me climb and fall, and climb again without comment, holding his small fire below me so that I could see the wall's surface when I needed to, and navigate by touch when I did not. The speakers sent a woman to talk to me. She was the keeper of the moss channels on the eastern wall, a position of considerable authority because the eastern channels produced the bulk of our food, and the keeper's decisions about harvesting schedules affected everyone. She found me in the deep gallery during a rest period and sat near enough that I could hear her breathing, and told me, in the measured and unhurried way of someone who has rehearsed difficult words, that the speakers were concerned about the materials I was consuming. The iron spikes, the dark glass, the fungal fiber. These were communal resources, and my use of them had begun to affect the supply available for the dwelling's maintenance. The eastern channels needed new supports. The firekeeper needed iron for his tending tools, and here I was in the deep galleries, using the world's limited materials on something the speakers could not endorse and the hymn could not explain. I told her the throat could be climbed. She was silent for a time. Then she said something that I have carried with me like a stone in my chest. She said the taken were gone, and that making oneself taken was not rescue but waste. She said I was needed in the dwellings, that my hands were good hands, that the eastern channels could use a man who understood how things fit together. She said the word together with a weight that made me understand she was not only talking about moss supports. I did not argue with her. Argument would have required me to explain what I intended, and explaining would have required the speaker's permission, and the speakers would never grant permission for what I intended, because what I intended was the opposite of the hymn. I told her I would replace the materials I used. I would find new spikes in the unexplored passages. I would chip new glass. I would harvest extra fiber in the intervals between my climbing practice. She left without acknowledging the offer, which meant the speakers had expected me to refuse entirely and would now have to decide what to do about partial compliance. They decided to move me, not formally. There was no mechanism for formal exile in a community that depended on proximity for survival, but by degrees. My sleeping alcove, which was Heffen's alcove, was reassigned. The reasoning given was structural. The wall behind the alcove showed signs of instability, microfractures that could worsen. This was plausible. It might even have been true. But the new alcove they offered was deeper in the dwellings, further from the throat, closer to the speaker's own quarters where my activities could be observed. I moved the iron wheel and my sleeping cloths and my growing inventory of spikes and rope and dark glass into the new space. And I noticed that the passage between the new alcove and the deep galleries where I practiced was longer, more convoluted, requiring me to pass through the central gathering space where the speakers sat and the hymn was sung. They wanted me to see them. They wanted me to see the community I was, in their view, abandoning. They wanted the hymn to reach me on every trip to the deep galleries, to remind me of the words, to pull me back into the shape the world required. It did not work. Or rather, it worked in a direction they did not intend. Every time I passed through the gathering space and heard the hymn, I heard it the way the elder had taught me to hear it. Not as praise, as grief, as the sound a people makes when they have been broken and have chosen to call the breaking holy rather than face what it actually was. And each time I heard it that way, my grip on the next spike was a little surer and the rope braiding went a little faster, and the dark glass shaped a little more cleanly under the grinding stone. I learned things about the stone that I had not known. I learned that the world's walls were not uniform, that they varied in texture, in density, in the size and frequency of the holds they offered. The walls near the dwellings were worn smooth by generations of hands. The walls in the old workings were rougher, scarred by the first people's tools, and the walls of the throat. I went close enough to feel them during the safe intervals, pressing my face to the stone and reaching as high as my arms would allow. The walls of the throat were different from either. They were regular, perfectly circular in cross-section, as though the throat had been bored through the stone by a single massive tool turning on a central axis. The walls were grooved in a spiral pattern that ascended as far as my fingers could reach, and the grooves were deep enough to hold a spike if I drove it at the correct angle. This regularity confirmed what Heffen had suspected. The throat was not natural. It had been made, and whatever had made it had come from above. The elder brought me food. Not every day. He was forgetful, or perhaps deliberate in his forgetting. Either way, the irregularity kept me from depending on him, which I think he intended. He brought moss cakes and the pale grubs that lived in the deepest galleries, and he sat with me sometimes while I worked. And once he put his hand on the visor pieces I had laid out on the stone shelf and ran his fingers over them, with the same care I had seen Heffen use when examining the throat's walls. He told me something then that I have thought about every day since. He said the first people had not always lived in the dark. He said the speaker's oldest words, if you listened to them from a different angle, describe not a creation, but a catastrophe. Not the world being made, but the world being broken, and the first people not placed here by design, but trapped here by accident. He said the hymn was not a hymn of praise, but a hymn of grief, and that the speakers had forgotten the difference because forgetting was easier than remembering. I asked him where the first people had come from, if not from the dark. He said he did not know, but that the tool marks in the old workings pointed in one direction, and that direction was up. The last thing I made was the pack. It would hold the visor, the spikes, the rope, the harness, the food I would carry. Moss cakes compressed into dense blocks, grubs sealed in pouches of stiffened cloth, and the weapon. The weapon was the simplest thing I built. It was a spike. The longest, heaviest spike I could find in the old workings, resharpened to a point that drew blood from my thumb when I tested it, mounted on a shaft of dense stone that I had ground into a cylinder over months of patient work. It was not elegant. It was not clever. It was a thing for killing, and I had made it because I intended to kill whatever had taken my brother. I left during a safe interval. The elder was the only one who knew I was going, and he did not try to stop me. He put his hand on my face. His fingers were dry and warm, papery with age, and they smelled of the small fire he tended. And he told me the throat was longer than I thought. He said the first people's stories, the ones the speakers had smoothed into the hymn, spoke of a distance that could not be climbed in a single effort. He said I would need to rest on the walls, to sleep while hanging from my harness, to eat and drink in the vertical dark, and that the temptation to come back down would be stronger than any physical exhaustion. I told him I would not come down without Heffen. He took his hand away. I heard him turn back toward the dwellings. His footsteps were soft, careful. The footsteps of a man who navigated the world by memory and sound, and the faintest suggestion of warmth from the stone. And I listened to them until they disappeared, and then I was alone with the throat. The first spike went in cleanly. The spiral grooves accepted it at a slight upward angle, and when I tested my weight, the spike held without shifting. I drove the second spike higher, as far above my head as I could reach, and pulled myself up, and for the first time in my life, I was inside the throat, and the stone curved around me in a perfect circle. And the dark above me was absolute, and the dark below me was absolute, and the only difference between them was that one was where I had been, and the other was where Heffen had gone. I climbed. The rhythm established itself within the first 100 body lengths. Drive the spike, test the hold, move the lower foot to the higher spike, reach, drive again. I carried 12 spikes. This was all the iron I could manage, along with the pack, the rope, the harness, the food, and the weapon. 12 meant a rotating set. When I had driven the 12th and climbed past the first, I reached down and worked the lowest free, pulling it from the groove with a twisting motion that loosened the stone's grip, then carried it up to drive above the highest. The count I kept in my head was not spikes, but drives. The total number of times iron had entered stone since I left the gallery floor. By the 100th drive, the system was automatic. By the 200th, my hands could free a lower spike and carry it overhead without my thinking about it at all. My hands learned the wall's curvature. My shoulders learned the angle at which the spike seated most securely. My legs learned the spacing that distributed weight evenly between the harness and the holds. The spiral grooves were a gift I had not expected. They provided a continuous track for the spikes, a helical path that wound upward through the stone like the thread of a screw, and I followed it, as the first people might have followed it, turning as I climbed, the wall rotating past me in a slow, blind spiral. The turning made direction impossible. After the first several 100 body lengths, I could no longer tell if I was facing the same wall I had started on, or its opposite. The spiral pulled me around the throat's circumference in a steady revolution that had nothing to do with the vertical progress I was making, and the two motions, the upward crawl and the lateral rotation, compounded into a disorientation that lived in my stomach rather than my head. I was climbing, and I was turning, and I was somewhere inside the stone, and below me the world was receding at a pace I could not feel. And above me the giant's country was approaching at a pace I could not measure, And between the two, I hung on iron spikes I had sharpened myself, turning and turning in the dark. The air changed first. In the dwellings, the air was still, heavy, tasting of stone and water, and the faint char of the elders' fires. In the throat, the air moved, not wind, something subtler, a current that came from above and carried with it a something I had never encountered, a dryness that made my lips crack and my nostrils sting. The current grew stronger as I climbed, and I pressed my face into the stone and breathed through my teeth and thought about what kind of place could produce air this dry and this empty of the moisture that the world breathed out through every surface. I rested the first time when my arms would no longer obey. I hung in the harness and ate a moss cake and drank from the water skin and felt the current moving past me, up to down, a slow exhalation from whatever waited above. The stone against my back was different here, warmer. Not the ambient warmth of the dwellings, which was the warmth of bodies and fires, and the earth's own heat rising from below. This warmth came from the walls themselves, as though the stone had absorbed heat from a source I could not yet perceive and was releasing it slowly, reluctantly, the way a fired clay pot releases its heat long after the coals have died. I slept. I do not know for how long. When I woke, the current had shifted. It was stronger now, and the dryness had intensified, and there was something else in it, a depth I can only describe as complexity. The air in the dwellings had 2 or 3 components: stone, water, fire residue. The air in the throat had dozens. I could taste them separately, a sharpness that made my sinuses contract and left a clean, stinging residue on the roof of my mouth, like the air above the elder's fire, but without the warmth. A green note like nothing I had ever encountered. Not stone, not water, not fungus, not any living thing the world contained, but unmistakably alive, unmistakably the product of something growing. And beneath both, a heavy, sweet quality that coated the back of the throat and suggested flesh, not the flesh of the grubs or the fungi, but something larger, something warm-blooded, something that breathed the same air and metabolized it differently. These were the smells of the giant's country filtering down through the throat. I cataloged them the way I cataloged the wall's texture, as data, as information, as evidence of what waited above. But the green smell troubled me. I had no framework for it. The world did not contain anything that smelled like that, and the absence of a category made the smell insistent in a way the others were not. It pressed against my awareness and would not settle into any familiar shape. I drove the next spike and climbed. The wall changed, not its regularity. The spiral grooves continued, faithful and unvarying. Something had been applied to the stone. I ran my fingers over it and felt a thin layer of something that was not stone and not metal, but harder than either. Smooth as water-worn rock, but uniform in a way that water could never produce. It coated the wall in a continuous sheet, and where it was intact, my spikes had difficulty finding purchase. I had to drive them harder, aim for the grooves where the coating was thinnest, search for cracks with my fingertips before committing my weight. And there were things bolted to the wall. The first was at roughly the 500th drive, and if my count was still accurate. My reaching hand found not the expected curve of grooved stone, but a protrusion, a flat surface mounted perpendicular to the wall, extending inward toward the center of the throat. I explored it with both hands while hanging from the harness. It was rectangular, metal but not the corroded iron of the old workings. This metal was smoother, lighter and cold, in a way that felt manufactured rather than geological. The edges were folded, deliberate, and the surface bore marks, not the parallel gouges of the first people's tools. Something else, a system of raised ridges organized into rows, regular and repeating, like the marks left by a heated stamp pressed into wax. I traced them with my fingertips. They were small, deliberate, and completely incomprehensible. A language, perhaps, or a notation. Something left on the walls of the throat for purposes I could not imagine. The plate itself vibrated faintly under my fingers, a constant low tremor that was not the stone's natural settling, but something transmitted from above through the metal's own substance, as though the plate were connected to a larger system that I could feel operating through the vibration, the way one can feel a conversation through a hand laid on someone's chest without hearing the words. There was something else about the raised marks. I lingered on them longer than I should have, hanging from the harness with both hands on the plate, my fingertips tracing the rows. They were organized. They were intentional. And I struggled with this thought and struggle with it still. They were the right size for hands like mine. The spacing between the rows matched the spacing of my fingertips. The depth of the ridges matched the sensitivity of my touch. If this was a notation system, it had been made for someone built to the same scale as me. And this was a fact that did not fit the speaker's account of the giants, who were vast, whose limbs spanned the throat's full width, whose bodies blocked the white dawn when they descended. I did not follow the thought to its conclusion. I let it go the way I had let go of the green smell, as a thing my framework could not hold. I moved past it and climbed. More plates appeared at regular intervals, and as I ascended, they became more frequent, more elaborate. Some of them mounted beside structures I could not identify. Cylindrical housings bolted to the wall, clusters of thin cordage bundled and fixed at intervals, a metal box from which heavy ropes descended into the darkness below me, still taut, still under tension from whatever they were anchored to. I pulled one of the ropes. It was thick, braided metal, stronger than anything I had made, stronger than anything the first people had left. It hummed when I pulled it, not with a musical note, but with a dense, complex vibration that suggested enormous sustained load, as though somewhere above me a machine of considerable size was holding the other end under tension. The vibration traveled up through the throat and down through my arms and into my chest, where it sat like a second heartbeat. I left it and climbed. At roughly the 700th drive, I encountered something I could not at first identify. The cables on the wall nearest me converged. 4 of them, then 6, then more, gathering into a dense bundle that angled away from the wall and toward the throat's center. I followed the bundle with my hand as far as I could reach without leaving the wall, and my fingers found a vertical structure running through the middle of the shaft, a rail or a track. 2 parallel bars of heavy metal, bolted together with cross braces at regular intervals, the whole assembly anchored to the walls by lateral struts that extended like the spokes of a wheel from the central track to mounting points in the spiral grooves. The track was massive. The bars were as thick as my forearm, and the space between them was wide enough to admit something the size of a man. Wider, perhaps, wide enough for a man and the bulk of heavy equipment besides. The inner surfaces of the bars were polished smooth by friction, worn in a pattern that spoke of repeated passage at high speed. Something traveled this track regularly, ascending and descending, and the guide surfaces were burnished to a finish I could feel even through my calluses. The cross braces showed the same wear, deformed slightly in the direction of travel, bent by the accumulated force of whatever rode the track, pressing against them as it passed. This was how the giants descended, not by climbing as I climbed. On this central rail, this track, this engineered highway driven through the axis of the throat. The cables were support and stabilization. and the terrible speed with which the shape had descended during the reaching that took Heffen, the compressive wave that had filled the gallery, the velocity that had pulled him from my grip. The speed was the tracks, designed for rapid transit of the full depth of the throat. I was climbing the walls. The track occupied the center. As long as I stayed on the spiral grooves pressed to the wall, the descending apparatus would pass through the throat's axis without touching me. But the lateral struts, the heavy spokes that connected track to wall at every few body lengths, the very protrusions I had been climbing around since I discovered them, those occupied the space between the track and the spiral grooves. Whatever descended on the rail would carry stabilizing arms of its own, counterweights and guide extensions that reached toward the walls, and if I was occupying the groove where a strut met the stone when the apparatus passed, I would be sheared from the wall or crushed between the moving mass and the rock. The cables vibrated on all sides, and the machine noise filled the throat, and the light above me intensified with each body length. And I climbed toward it, because the alternative was to be caught from above in the vertical dark, pinned against the wall by whatever the cables were lowering, and I had not come this far to be taken the way Heffen had been taken. The machines above me stopped. The silence came without warning. One moment, the deep, pervasive thudding that had been growing in the walls for the last several hundred body lengths was there, the deep, rhythmic pulse I had been absorbing through my hands and harness and the bones of my jaw, and the next moment, it was not. The high tonal whine ceased. The grinding stopped. The cables around me went slack by a fraction, settling into new tension lines with a series of quiet, metallic pops that traveled down the throat like a chain of small detonations. And then there was nothing. Not the nothing of the dark, which I knew, which was full and warm and inhabited by the sounds of the world. Water in channels, bodies shifting in alcoves, the elder's fire breathing. This was a nothing so complete it had texture. I hung in my harness and listened to my own breathing and the creak of the fungal fiber rope and the small sounds my body made. The click of my jaw, the rush of blood past my eardrums, the ticking of my joints. And I understood for the first time that the machine sounds had been company. They had been evidence of something alive above me, something operating, something that justified the climb by confirming there was a destination. In their absence, the throat became what it had always been, a hole in the stone, vertical, purposeless, and I was a man hanging in it from handmade rope, and below me was everything I had ever known, and above me was a silence I could not read. The temptation the elder had warned me about arrived not as a desire to descend, but as a conviction that the climb had no end, that the throat went up forever, that the giants had abandoned it or had never existed, and that I would climb until the food ran out, and then hang in the harness until the rope failed and then fall, and the world below would never know what had happened to me, only that I had gone into the throat and not returned, as all the taken did not return. I drove the next spike. The sound of iron on stone was enormous in the silence, and I flinched at it. And then I drove the spike again and again, and the climbing rhythm restored itself. Drive, test, step, reach. And I climbed into the silence, and the silence held. The machines resumed with violence. Whether I had been hanging in the silence for minutes or hours, I cannot say. The disorientation of the spiral had merged with the disorientation of the silence to produce a state in which time moved differently, or not at all. But the return was not gradual. The deep thudding hit the walls like a fist, a single massive percussion that traveled through the stone and into my harness and up through my spine, and then another and another, settling into the rhythm I had grown accustomed to, but at twice the intensity, as though the machines above had been resting and were now working at full capacity. The cables around me snapped taut. The slack I had felt during the silence vanished in an instant, and the heavy braided metal ropes that ran down the throat's walls went rigid, vibrating with a tension that I could feel in the air between them. A low, pressurized hum that was not sound exactly, but the sensation of enormous forces being held in balance. Something was descending on the central track. I could not see it, and I could not hear it over the machine noise, but I could feel it in the cable's behavior. The tension shifting, redistributing, the lateral struts transmitting a new pattern of stress from the track to the walls, and in the track itself, which had begun to vibrate with a frequency that was different from the general machine noise, a localized, directional tremor that said something heavy was moving on the polished rails and moving downward. The giants were coming down. The machines were their means of descent. This I had theorized from the harness and confirmed from the track, and the restart meant a descent was beginning, and something was riding the central rail toward me. The light came gradually, not the sudden column of the white dawn which fell like a weapon. This was something else, a slow change in the character of the darkness that I perceived first, not with my eyes, but with my skin. The warmth in the walls increased. The air's complexity deepened. And then so faintly that I could not be certain I was not imagining it, I could see. Not see in the way the Elder's fire allowed seeing. And that was a suggestion, a sketch of form in orange and shadow. This was a presence of light so diffuse it had no source, no direction, no color I could name. It was simply there, the way warmth was there, the way the air's dryness was there. A property of the upper throat that intensified as I climbed, and that turned the stone walls from something I could only know by touch into something that had dimension, texture, and, for the first time in my experience, color. The stone was gray. I had not known stone could be gray. In the firelight of the dwellings, stone was orange-black, a warm surface that reflected flame. Here, in the nameless light of the upper throat, it was the color of ash, of the pressed moss cakes after they burned, of something that had lost all warmth and retained only form. The spiral grooves cast shadows, shadows which I had never seen, which are the children of light and surface and angle, and which lay in the grooves like dark water in channels, and I stared at them with an avidity I cannot describe, because they were new, because they were beautiful, because they proved that the world above was real and that I was approaching it. My visor was in the pack. I stopped climbing and hung in the harness and fitted it over my eyes with hands that shook from fatigue and from something else, a trembling that came from the stomach rather than the muscles, a recognition that I was closer to the giant's country than any living person had been and returned. Through the dark glass, the faint light dimmed to almost nothing, and I was back in the near dark, back in the familiar, and the shaking eased. I climbed with the visor on. The grooves were harder to find by touch alone, the spikes harder to seat, the progress slower, but the light continued to intensify. It grew from a presence to a pressure, a physical weight against the visor, a warmth on the skin of my hands and face that was no longer the ambient radiation of heated stone, but something direct, something aimed, something that came from above with an intentionality I could feel in the bones of my cheeks and the ridges of my brow. And then I heard it. The sound I had heard all my life from below. The grinding, shrieking vibration that preceded the dawn was different here. At this distance, this proximity, the components separated. The grinding was mechanical. Metal against metal, a rhythmic stress and release that had the regularity of a heartbeat. The shrieking was not shrieking at all, but a high tonal whine, constant and unwavering, like a tensioned wire vibrating in a current of air. And beneath both, so low it was more sensation than sound, the heavy rhythmic thudding that I felt in the walls and in my harness and in the bones of my skull, heard from below, compressed by distance and distorted by the throat's acoustics. These sounds became the terrifying cacophony the speakers described. Heard from here, they were something else. They were organized. They were intentional. And they were, in a way I could not name and did not want to examine, patient. They sounded like a machine that had been running for a very long time and would continue running for as long as it was needed. I found the harness. It was hanging from the wall, bolted to a metal bracket that was itself bolted to the stone. It was made of a material I had never touched, thick, flexible, enormously strong, woven in a pattern more complex than anything the First People's remnants suggested was possible. Straps and buckles and adjustment points, all manufactured to a precision that made my own climbing harness feel like a child's first attempt at braiding fiber. And it was sized. I noticed this and then tried not to notice it, the way one tries not to notice a crack in a load-bearing wall. It was sized for a body approximately the size of mine. Not vast, not spanning the throat. The straps were wide, yes, and padded with a material I could not identify, but when I held one strap against my own torso, the proportions were not grotesque. They were generous. They were the proportions of something made for a person somewhat larger than me, wearing additional bulk, perhaps armored or insulated, but a person nonetheless. I understood this was the giant's gear. They used it to descend, but the understanding sat uneasily beside the evidence of its size, and I climbed past it faster than I should have, driving spikes carelessly, letting the rhythm break, wanting distance between myself and the thing that was the wrong size for the story I had been told. Above me, the light intensified. Even through the visor, I could see the walls in detail now. The gray stone, the spiral grooves, the metal plates with their raised marks in a color I would later learn was called red, the bolted hardware, the ropes and cables and structural elements that covered the upper throat in a dense mechanical skin. I could see my own hands. They were pale. They were the color of the grubs that lived in the deep galleries, a whiteness that had never been exposed to anything but the dark, and that looked in this burning illumination like something carved from bone. The air here stung in a way the lower air had not. It carried a sharpness that bit the inside of my nose and left a residue that tasted of neither stone nor fire, but of something I could only think of as energy, as though the air itself were charged with a force that had no name in the dwelling's vocabulary. The green smell was stronger here, too, so strong it was nearly a taste. And the sweet flesh smell had resolved into something specific and haunting. It was the smell of living skin, not grub skin or fungus skin, but the warm, slightly sour smell of a person's arm or neck, concentrated and present in the air the way the smell of the elder's fire was present in the gallery, as though many people had recently occupied this space and left their warmth in it. This troubled me more than the harness. The giants should not smell like people. I climbed the last stretch with my jaw tight and my hands working faster than the rhythm warranted, driving spikes at angles I had not tested, trusting holds I had not verified, because the alternative was to stop and think about what the smell meant, and I could not afford to think about what the smell meant. Not here, not now. Not with Heffen above me and the weapon on my back and the visor between me and the burning light that was now so intense I could feel its heat through the dark glass on my closed eyelids. And then the heat changed. It did not diminish gradually. At a certain height, I felt the transition as a line across my body, a border I climbed through. The searing, directional weapon heat that had characterized the dawn for my entire life simply stopped. The light remained. The light, if anything, intensified. A diffuse, sourceless brilliance that pressed against the visor from every angle, that had no column, no beam, no axis of projection. But the heat was gone. The skin of my arms and neck, which had been burning since the lower reaches of the upper throat, registered a warmth that was gentle rather than aggressive. The warmth of air heated by a distant source rather than the concentrated thermal assault of whatever the giants mounted on their descending apparatus. I did not understand this. The speakers made no distinction between the light and the heat. Both were the white dawn, both were the weapon, both came from above as a single annihilating force. But my skin was telling me something the speakers had not accounted for. That the weapon heat belonged to the throat, to the machinery inside it, to the apparatus that rode the central track, and that the light above the throat was something else, something vast and everywhere, and still capable of killing eyes, but not the same as the dawn, not the same at all. I did not follow this thought to its conclusion either. There was no room for it. I had a visor and a weapon and a brother to find, and the machines were operating, and the track was bearing weight, and I climbed. The lip of the throat was a defined edge. I felt it before I saw it. The stone ended, and beyond it there was nothing. Not the nothing of the dark, which was full, which was stone and water and bodies and breath, which was the only nothing I had ever known. This was a different nothing. An openness so vast that my reaching hand found no surface, no wall, no ceiling, no boundary in any direction. The air moves freely here in a way it never moved in the world. It pressed against me from all sides, filled with the green smell and the skin smell and the charged sharpness, and it moved with a randomness that had no equivalent in the still channels of the dwellings. And the light was everywhere, coming from everywhere, a totality that the visor could not fully contain. It bled around the edges. It found the gaps where leather met skin. It pressed against the dark glass with a weight that made my temples ache. I pulled myself over the lip, and I stood on a surface that was flat and gritty under my feet. And the sound of the machines was deafening now, enormous, surrounding me in every direction. And the light pressed against the visor from all sides, not from above as it had in the throat, but from the entirety of the space, as though the space itself were made of light. Then, from my left, distant but unmistakable, a voice. Not the machine voice, not the grinding or the whine or the thud. A human voice, ragged, making speech sounds I could not parse through the machine noise. And in the speech sounds, repeated twice, and then again, a rhythm I knew. 2 syllables, rising and falling in a pattern my ears had carried for years, a pattern I had last heard compressed and distorted by the acoustics of the throat on the day Heffen was taken, rising away from me as the giant pulled him up. My name. Someone above. Someone here in the giant's country, in the burning light, was calling my name. I tore the visor off. I did not decide. The decision was made somewhere beneath the part of me that plans and weighs and reasons, in the place where Heffen's hand was still on my shoulder, and his voice was still telling me the world could be changed. The visor came away from my face, and the light came in, and I opened my eyes because he was here. He was alive, and I would see him. I would see my brother's face for the first time in my life. What struck my eyes was not illumination, it was annihilation. Every receptor fired simultaneously, and then burned out in a cascade that took less than a heartbeat and lasted forever. The pain was not pain as I had known it, not the sharp specificity of a cut or a burn or a spike driven into flesh. It was total. It filled my skull from the inside and kept filling, a pressure that had no source and no boundary, and the world behind my eyes. The gray stone and the pale hands and the shadows in the grooves and the color I had just begun to learn turned white and then turned nothing, and I understood, in the way one understands a physical law by being subjected to it, that my eyes were dead. I was turned. Standing at the top of the throat, on the flat, gritty surface, in the openness I could not see, I was turned. I had carried the visor up the throat and worn it through the burning light, and it had kept me safe, and I had torn it away myself because I thought I heard my brother's voice, and now I could not see. I could never see again. I could not see. But the voice was closer. The grit scraping of feet moving fast across the flat surface, and the voice breaking and reforming around the same two syllables, and the feet were close now, very close, and the voice was coming apart the way a voice comes apart when the throat producing it has tightened past the point of controlled speech. I raised the spike, my weapon, the killing tool I had carried up the throat. I raised it, and I faced the sound, and I waited. The impact was not what I expected. No strike, no grip of jointed limbs reaching down from above. Instead, a body pressed against mine, chest to chest, arms around my shoulders and the back of my neck, squeezing with a desperate force that was nothing like the engineered regularity of the giant's descent. The grip was wrong, too warm, too yielding. The body against mine was not armored in the heavy material I had felt on the harness. It was soft, thin-clothed, trembling with a violence that transmitted through the ribs into my own. And the sound it made, the sound that filled my ear because its face was pressed against the side of my head, was not the grinding shriek of the machines. It was a voice, a human voice, ragged with something I recognized from the gallery after a taking. The sound the mothers made, the sound the partners made, the sound the world made when it lost someone to the giants and could not get them back. The sound of grief so old it had worn grooves in the throat that produced it, like water wearing grooves in stone. And beneath the grief, the same two syllables, my name, over and over, spoken into the side of my skull with a breath that was warm and wet and human. My arms dropped, not by decision, by a dissolution of the tension that had held them raised since I gripped the lip. The spike's weight pulled my hand down, and the point struck stone, and the sound it made was the sound of the gallery, of iron on rock, of home. And for a fraction of a second that lasted the rest of my life, I leaned into the embrace the way I had leaned into Heffen's side in the gallery, the way I had leaned into the dark after every dawn, and the body holding me tightened its grip and made a sound that was almost a word and almost not. And my name was in it, the way my name had been in the cry Heffen made when the giant took him. And the smell of this body was the smell I had detected in the upper throat. Living skin, warm, human, familiar in a way that had no name. But I could not hold it. The framework was too strong, too old, too deeply worn into the shape of my understanding. I was in the giant's country. The light had killed my eyes. Something was gripping me with limbs that felt like arms in a space that blazed with the weapon heat. And the speaker's oldest word said that the giants took the living, that the grip of a giant was the last sensation before the consuming, that the voice a giant made was the voice of hunger wearing the shape of something beloved in order to paralyze its prey. I struck with the spike, not at the body. I could not drive the point into the yielding softness pressed against me. I could not. and this failure to strike was the last true thing that my body knew. But at the arms, bringing the shaft down hard on the grip that held my shoulders. The impact traveled up through the stone handle and into my wrists, and I felt the arms shudder, and then I felt something give beneath the blow. Not the breaking of armor, not the cracking of a giant's jointed exoskeleton, but a small, specific, terrible sound like a green branch snapping, and a vibration through the body pressed against mine that was nothing like the calibrated force of the machines, nothing like the inhuman strength the speakers described, but was instead the shudder of a body registering damage it had not expected and could not absorb. The arms loosened. The voice made a sound, a short, breathless intake, a sound I knew from the dwellings when a man's foot found the edge of a drop in the dark, or a woman's hand closed on a sharp edge she had not felt coming. A sound of purely human surprise at purely human pain. But I could not hold this knowledge either. The framework took it, as it had taken the human-sized plates and the human-proportioned harness and the smell of living skin, took it and made it small, made it fit, interpreted the branch snap as a giant's joint flexing and the gasp as a predator's frustration, and the shudder as the recoiling of something immense gathering itself for a second strike. I twisted free. I stumbled backward, and my foot found the edge, the lip of the throat, the defined boundary between the flat surface and the vertical drop, the line between the giant's country and the world. Behind me was the dark. Below me was the throat, and the long fall, and the dwellings, and the gallery, and the alcove where the iron wheel still sat on its shelf. The voice said my name once more, very clearly, very close. And the arms reached for me again. I felt the displaced air, the warmth of hands passing near my face. And the gentleness of that reaching was so much worse than violence, so much harder to understand, and the framework could not hold it, and I could not hold it. And the only thing that was left was the dark, the only constant the world had ever offered, the mercy the speakers had promised, the home that I had climbed away from and that waited below me now with its absolute, lightless patience. I stepped back. My foot found nothing, and I fell. The wind came first, a roar that built from silence to a tearing force in the space of a breath, ripping at my clothes, pulling the pack from my shoulders, driving into my open mouth with a pressure that made breathing an act of will. My stomach dropped away from me as though the organs inside my body were separating, each falling at its own speed, and the weightlessness was total, a sensation I had never experienced, the absolute absence of the stone support that had been beneath my feet every moment of my life. But the dark rose up around me as the heat of the surface fell away. First, a diminishing warmth on my whole body, then on my upturned face alone, then on nothing at all. And the wind was the dark's breath, the dark rushing to receive me, and the weightlessness was the feeling of being carried, and the cold that bit into my exposed skin as I fell deeper was the familiar temperature of the world returning, the mercy of stone and water and stillness after the burning nightmare above. I was going back. The giant had not taken me. I had gone into the burning void, and I had come back, and the dark was where I belonged. The air thickened around me as I fell, wetter, heavier, and the speed of my descent pressed it against my face like a hand, like a palm laid flat against my cheek, and I could not tell the difference between falling and being held, between the rush of air and the steady grip that had always guided me through the passages of the world. And the roaring in my ears was the hymn. It was the hymn. It was the oldest words. And I have been telling the story for the whole of my descent, and the telling is nearly done, and the ground is close, and the two syllables faded above me, growing thin, growing distant, and some part of me, The part that had leaned into the embrace, the part that had recognized the gallery in the arms and the alcove in the warmth and the hand on shoulder in the grip. That part heard them clearly, more clearly than the speaker's oldest words, more clearly than the hymn, more clearly than anything the world had ever said. And that part knew what they meant. But it was a small part, and it was very far away, and the dark was close, and the dark was everything, and the falling was fast, and the silence was almost complete, and I was home.